HOA Karen didn't send a letter, didn't knock on my door, didn't hide behind policy language or laminated warnings. She walked straight up to my child at a public bus stop and decided she had authority over him. She raised her voice, crowded his space, and spoke to him like she owned the ground under his feet. That was the moment she crossed from nuisance into criminal. That was the moment her fate locked itself into place. I watched it happen from 20 feet away, close enough to hear her tone, close enough to see my kid freeze. She wasn't enforcing rules, she was asserting dominance. And she chose the worst possible target to test it on. My son didn't cry, didn't argue, didn't run. He just looked confused, like children do when an adult breaks the social contract in front of them. That confusion is what snapped something cold and permanent into place inside me. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? HOA. Karen thought she was untouchable because she had been allowed to act that way before. She thought a clipboard and a loud voice gave her jurisdiction. She thought fear counted as compliance. She thought the bus stop belonged to her because nobody had ever stopped her. She was wrong on every count. I didn't intervene immediately, not because I hesitated, but because I understood the value of letting a crime fully commit itself. I have spent decades watching people hang themselves with their own certainty. Power abusers don't stop when challenged early, they escalate, and escalation is where evidence becomes undeniable. My kid stood there with his backpack hanging off one shoulder, while HOA Karen lectured him about boundaries she invented in her head. She told him he wasn't allowed to stand there without permission. She told him he was violating community standards. She told him she would handle it if it happened again. Every word she said was a confession wrapped in arrogance. The other parents watched in silence. Some uncomfortable, some resigned, some pretending not to see. That silence is what predators rely on. It gives them oxygen. HOA Karen thrived on that oxygen. She leaned in closer, close enough that I could see my son tense. That's when I stepped forward. Not fast, not loud, not dramatic. Slow enough that she noticed me and kept talking anyway. She assumed I was another parent she could bulldoze. She assumed wrong. I asked her a simple question, calm and flat, the kind of question that sounds harmless until it isn't. I asked her under what authority she was threatening a minor on a public street. She laughed. That laugh told me everything I needed to know about how far gone she was. She told me the HOA had rules. She told me the bus stop was within her jurisdiction. She told me I should be grateful she was being lenient. She told me she could escalate if she needed to. Each sentence tightened the case against her. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't reveal anything yet. I let her speak. I let her posture. I let her believe she was in control. That belief is fragile. It shatters beautifully when exposed to reality. I asked her to step away from my child. She refused. That refusal was the line. From that moment forward, this stopped being a parenting moment and became a law enforcement matter. HOA Karen didn't know who I was, and that ignorance was the last comfort she would have for a while. She told me she would document the interaction. She told me she would report us. She told me I was making a mistake. I agreed with her out loud. I told her she was absolutely right. I told her mistakes were being made. That seemed to satisfy her. Bullies love agreement when they think it's surrender. She stepped back half a pace, satisfied, already imagining how she would retell this story later as another victory. My son looked up at me, searching my face. I gave him a nod, small and steady. That nod meant everything was about to change. I asked HOA Karen for her name. She gave it proudly. She asked for mine. I gave her my first name only. That omission mattered. She warned me again. She turned away. She believed it was over. That belief was her final error, because from that moment on, every step she took away from us was a step toward consequences she couldn't imagine yet. The bus arrived. My son boarded like nothing had happened. I stood there long enough for HOA Karen to feel the absence of resistance and mistake it for fear. Then I left. I didn't go home to cool off. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't vent to neighbors. I went to work, and when I walked into my office, I closed the door, sat down, and opened a file with her name on it. I didn't always introduce myself as the police chief, and I didn't earn that title by announcing it loudly. Authority that needs to be declared usually isn't real, and I learned that early in my career, back when my badge was newer than my instincts, and every call felt like a test I might fail. I came up through patrol, then investigations, then internal review, learning piece by piece how power actually moves through a system and how easily it can be abused by people who mistake proximity for permission. The uniform never impressed me as much as the responsibility behind it, because I saw too many people wear symbols without understanding what they owed the public in return. By the time I made chief, my approach had already hardened into something quiet and deliberate. I didn't chase headlines, didn't posture at press conferences, didn't enjoy the sound of my own authority. I preferred systems that worked when nobody was watching, policies that protected people who would never know my name, and accountability that didn't require spectacle. I had learned, painfully, that the worst abuses rarely came from obvious criminals. They came from people who learned how to stand just close enough to legitimacy to scare others into compliance. That's why HOA Karen triggered something deeper than anger. She wasn't just loud or rude or overbearing. She was using the same mechanics I'd spent decades dismantling, only shrunk down to a suburban scale. She wrapped intimidation in procedure, threats in policy language, and fear in the illusion of order. She didn't need a badge because she was counting on people assuming she had one. She didn't need jurisdiction because she relied on nobody challenging her version of it. That kind of behavior doesn't stay contained. It spreads until someone stops it. My authority didn't come from the title on my door. It came from knowing exactly how lines get crossed and how predators rationalized it to themselves. I had interrogated people who skimmed millions and justified it as fees. I had watched officials threaten livelihoods with paperwork and call it compliance. I had seen how quickly a community can be trained into silence when enough people decide it's easier not to push back. HOA Karen was running the same playbook, just without the sophistication to hide it well. I thought about that as I reviewed my notes from the bus stop. Time, location, witnesses, language used, proximity to a minor, refusal to disengage. Every detail mattered, not because I needed to build a dramatic case, but because patterns don't exist in isolation. Authority, real authority, is about recognizing patterns early and stopping them before they become normalized. The law isn't reactive by design. It's preventative when used correctly. My background gave me an advantage HOA Karen never considered. I understood the difference between private agreements and public space, between civil disputes and criminal conduct, between community guidelines and unlawful coercion. I knew exactly where her imagined power ended, and I knew she had stepped far past it the moment she targeted a child. Children are a bright line in the law, and anyone who ignores that line does so at their own risk. I also understood optics, not in the shallow sense, but in the way perception shapes behavior. I knew that if I confronted her publicly as the chief too early, she would retreat, adjust, and continue elsewhere. People like her don't stop when embarrassed. They adapt. They learn to hide better. The goal wasn't to scare her once. The goal was to end her ability to operate at all. That required patience, documentation, and a clear understanding of how she had been allowed to operate unchecked. Authority doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's either reinforced or tolerated by the people around it. HOA Karen had been tolerated long enough to believe she was untouchable. That belief was her most dangerous weapon and her biggest weakness. At home that night, my kid didn't talk much about the incident. Kids process things differently, and I didn't push. I watched him do homework, watched him laugh at something on television, watched him return to normal faster than the adults ever do. That resilience is what made my resolve absolute. No child should have to learn how to endure an adult's power trip, and no parent should have to calculate how much intimidation their kid can absorb before stepping in. I thought about the other families at that bus stop, the ones who stayed quiet, the ones who looked away. I didn't judge them. I understood them. Silence is often a survival strategy, especially when authority feels ambiguous. But ambiguity is exactly where abuse thrives. Clarifying it is part of my job, whether it happens in a boardroom or on a cracked sidewalk before school. The next morning, I didn't go back to the bus stop. I didn't want a repeat. I wanted escalation on my terms, in a controlled environment where facts mattered more than volume. I began mapping HOA Karen's footprint, not emotionally but structurally, where she operated, who she interacted with, what authority she claimed, how she enforced it. Every abuse of power leaves a trail if you know how to look for it. My career taught me that small tyrants often mirror big ones. They test boundaries incrementally, escalating when they don't encounter resistance. They target those least likely to fight back. They rely on the assumption that no one with real authority will bother to notice them. HOA Karen fit that profile perfectly. She didn't know it yet, but she had already drawn attention from the one system she couldn't intimidate. I wasn't motivated by revenge. I was motivated by correction. Systems that allow this kind of behavior rot from the inside, and ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It teaches the wrong lesson to everyone watching. My authority wasn't about flexing power. It was about restoring the balance she had disrupted and making sure the message was unmistakable. By the end of that day, I had a clear picture of who HOA Karen thought she was and who she actually was. The gap between those two things was where the case would live. She believed she was enforcing order. In reality, she was exploiting confusion. She believed she was untouchable. In reality, she had already exposed herself. The title on my door gave me reach. My experience gave me restraint. And my kid gave me certainty. Whatever happened next would happen cleanly, deliberately, and by the book. HOA Karen had mistaken tolerance for weakness, and that mistake was about to cost her everything she thought she controlled. HOA Karen didn't invent her power out of nowhere. She assembled it piece by piece from the same raw material every small tyrant uses: confusion, convenience, and fear. She learned quickly which words made people hesitate and which gestures made them comply. She wrapped herself in the language of regulation because regulation sounds official even when it isn't. Most people don't challenge paperwork. They assume someone else already checked it. That assumption is where she lived. Her operation wasn't sophisticated, but it didn't need to be. She positioned herself at choke points where people were distracted, tired, or emotionally compromised. The bus stop was perfect. Parents rushing to work, kids half awake, a routine everyone wanted to move through quickly. She didn't need to convince anyone she was right, only that resisting her would take more energy than giving in. That's how abuse embeds itself into daily life without ever announcing what it is. She relied on the idea that HOAs are inherently legitimate. People hear those three letters and think rules, contracts, consequences. They don't ask who wrote them or who enforces them. HOA Karen exploited that gap relentlessly. She spoke in absolutes. She referenced bylaws nobody had seen. She used phrases like community standards and compliance requirements to shut down questions before they formed. When challenged, she escalated volume, not substance. Loudness was her shield. The structure she claimed to represent was deliberately opaque. No clear board, no published minutes, no transparent process. She acted as president, enforcer, and judge all at once. That concentration of power isn't accidental. It's efficient for someone who doesn't want oversight. Every time she made a decision on the spot, she trained the neighborhood to accept unilateral authority. Over time, people stopped asking where her power came from and focused instead on avoiding it. Her abuse wasn't random. It followed a pattern that became obvious once I started looking. She targeted families new to the area, renters, parents juggling multiple jobs, anyone unlikely to have time or resources to push back. She avoided people with legal backgrounds or visible institutional connections. That selectivity wasn't instinct, it was strategy. Predators don't hunt where resistance is obvious. They hunt where silence is cheapest. She used children as leverage because children change the equation. Parents will tolerate a lot to protect their kids from conflict. She knew that. She exploited it. By inserting herself into spaces involving minors, she forced adults to choose between escalation and accommodation. Most chose accommodation, not because they agreed with her, but because they wanted the moment to end. Each accommodation reinforced her confidence and expanded her reach. Her presence altered behavior in subtle ways. Parents began arriving earlier or later to avoid her. Kids learned to keep their heads down. Conversations stopped when she appeared. That's how control manifests before anyone names it. When people adjust their routines around one person, that person has already won something. HOA Karen fed on that adaptation. It validated her sense of dominance. She documented everything selectively, not for accountability, but for intimidation. A clipboard doesn't just record, it threatens. The implication is always future consequences. She never needed to follow through consistently. The possibility was enough. Inconsistency actually helped her, because unpredictability keeps people off balance. Nobody knew which infraction would matter and which would be ignored. That uncertainty worked in her favor. She also cultivated allies, though they were allies in name only. People who liked proximity to authority. People who enjoyed enforcing rules without responsibility. They echoed her language, backed her publicly, and disappeared the moment things got complicated. She didn't need loyalty. She needed amplification. Every nod, every agreement in public made her appear more entrenched than she was. What made her dangerous wasn't intelligence or planning, it was repetition. She showed up every day. She made herself unavoidable. Over time, presence becomes perceived legitimacy. People assume that if someone has been doing something long enough, it must be allowed. That's how unlawful behavior hardens into routine. By the time anyone thinks to question it, the behavior feels normal. The bus stop was just one node in a larger network of control. She inserted herself anywhere rules could be implied, but not easily verified. Shared spaces, transitional moments, places where authority feels fuzzy. That fuzziness was her camouflage. She didn't need to win arguments. She needed to exhaust people before they started one. From a law enforcement perspective, her structure was brittle. It relied entirely on perception. There were no real checks, no lawful foundation, no documented jurisdiction. Strip away the assumption of authority, and there was nothing underneath but a loud individual making demands. That kind of structure collapses instantly once exposed, which is why people like her work so hard to prevent exposure in the first place. The more I analyzed her behavior, the clearer it became that this wasn't about maintaining order. It was about control for its own sake. Order has purpose. Control has appetite. HOA. Karen's appetite grew with every unchallenged interaction. Each time someone backed down, she pushed further the next day. That trajectory doesn't correct itself. It has to be stopped. I thought about how many times she had done this before my kid ever stood at that curb. How many small moments had piled up to give her the confidence to confront a child directly. That confidence didn't appear overnight. It was cultivated through tolerance and silence. Ending it meant addressing not just the incident, but the structure that allowed it. By the time I finished mapping her pattern, I knew exactly where the fault lines were. I knew which assumptions to challenge, which claims to verify, and which actions crossed from civil annoyance into criminal conduct. HOA Karen believed she was the center of a system. In reality, she was a single point of failure. And single points of failure are easy to bring down once you stop pretending they're something else. Discovery doesn't begin with confrontation, it begins with quiet verification. And that night I verified everything HOA Karen had been counting on people never checking. I started with the basics, not because they were dramatic, but because they were fatal to her narrative. Jurisdiction, authority, ownership, and enforcement power are not abstract concepts in the law. They are defined, recorded, and searchable. Anyone who actually has them can prove it in minutes. Anyone who doesn't avoids the question entirely. HOA Karen avoided it by talking louder. I pulled property records first because every HOA fantasy eventually collides with a map. The bus stop sat on a public easement maintained by the city, serviced by the school district, and regulated under municipal code. There was no overlap, no gray zone, no carve-out that could be twisted into private control. The sidewalk, the curb, the street, the signpost, all of it was public. That meant every word she spoke to my kid carried no legal weight whatsoever. It also meant she had knowingly presented herself as an authority where none existed. From there, I looked for the entity itself. Real HOAs leave trails. Articles of incorporation, bylaws, tax filings, board rosters, meeting minutes. They don't vanish just because someone stops paying attention. I searched the county database, the state registry, and the municipal records. Nothing. No active HOA tied to that block, that zone, or that name. There was no dormant status, no expired charter, no pending renewal. HOA Karen wasn't misapplying authority. She was inventing it. That distinction mattered. Misapplication suggests confusion. Invention suggests intent. Intent is what turns nuisance into crime. I documented every interaction reported by other parents. Dates, times, language used. Patterns emerged immediately. She favored mornings. She favored transitional moments. She favored situations where witnesses were present but distracted. She never left written notice behind. Everything was verbal, implied, and urgent. That wasn't sloppy. It was strategic. Verbal threats are harder to trace unless someone is paying attention. I was paying attention now. 2 parents came forward privately once they realized someone with real authority was listening. One described being told her child could be reported for truancy if she didn't comply with HOA rules. Another described being warned about future consequences for parking too close to the bus stop curb. Neither could identify where those rules were written. Neither had ever seen a board vote. Both had adjusted their behavior anyway. Fear had done its job. I obtained footage next. Not covert, not hidden, not manipulated. Public cameras, school district recordings, and personal devices from parents who had captured pieces of her behavior over time. Individually, each clip showed a loud woman asserting control. Together, they showed a sustained pattern of harassment focused on children and parents. The consistency was undeniable. She wasn't having bad days. She was running an operation. I requested statements from the school district. Their response was immediate and unequivocal. The bus stop was public. No HOA had authority there. No complaints had ever been lodged against families using it. No permissions were required. That single confirmation destroyed her core claim. Everything else she said relied on that claim being true. I cross-referenced her language with statute, threatening a minor, impersonating authority, coercive conduct, harassment. Each one fit cleanly. This wasn't a borderline case. It was textbook. The law doesn't care how confident someone sounds when they violate it. It cares what they did. The most telling discovery came from her own behavior once questioned. She didn't provide documents. She didn't offer clarification. She doubled down. She accused. She threatened escalation. People who believe they are right don't react that way when asked to explain themselves. People who know they are lying do. Every piece of proof pointed in the same direction. HOA Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was testing how much she could get away with. She relied on intimidation because intimidation doesn't require legitimacy. It only requires silence. The moment silence broke, her structure began to collapse. By the time I compiled the file, there was nothing left to speculate about. Jurisdiction was false. Authority was fabricated. Behavior was predatory. Impact was real. The discovery phase didn't reveal a misunderstanding. It revealed a person who had been allowed to operate unchecked long enough to believe she was immune. At that point, the question was no longer whether action was warranted. It was how to end it in a way that ensured it stayed ended. The confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom or an office. It happened exactly where she believed she was strongest, because that's where collapse is most complete. HOA Karen returned to the bus stop the following morning, expecting routine compliance. She arrived with the same posture, the same confidence, the same assumption that yesterday's silence would repeat itself today. What she didn't know was that silence had expired overnight. Parents were already there when she arrived, more of them than usual, standing closer together instead of spaced apart. That detail alone shifted the balance, though she didn't recognize it yet. Predators rely on isolation. Groups change the math. HOA Karen scanned the crowd the way she always did, looking for the easiest target, already preparing her opening line. She found me immediately and smiled like someone who believes the board is already won. She walked straight toward my kid again. That choice sealed the outcome faster than anything else could have. I stepped in front of him before she finished her first sentence, and for the first time since I'd met her, she hesitated. It wasn't fear yet, but it was confusion. Confusion is the crack where authority leaks out. I told her calmly, clearly, and loud enough for everyone nearby to hear that she needed to leave the area immediately. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't explain. I issued a directive. She laughed, reflexively, the way people do when they think laughter can override reality. Then she made the mistake of asking me who I thought I was to give her orders. I answered her with my full name and title. The sound that followed wasn't dramatic. It was the sound of air leaving a structure that had never been solid to begin with. You could see it in her face. The instant recalculation. the sudden awareness that she was no longer improvising against unarmed civilians. She tried to recover, tried to speak over me, tried to reassert control by repeating her claims louder. Volume didn't help her anymore. Everyone was watching, not out of habit, but out of recognition. I informed her that she was standing on public property. I informed her that she had no authority there. I informed her that she had been documented harassing minors. I informed her that she was being instructed, lawfully, to disengage and leave. Each statement was simple. Each one landed harder than the last because they were verifiable. She responded the only way she knew how, by accusing me of intimidation and threatening to call the police. That was the moment the crowd understood exactly what was happening. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A woman who had spent weeks bullying families now stood there threatening law enforcement at a public bus stop, completely unaware that she had already escalated past the point of retreat. Parents pulled out phones, not to provoke, not to threaten, but to record. Recording changes behavior. It forces accountability into places that rely on plausible deniability. She tried to leave then, but she didn't do it quietly. She kept talking, kept pointing, kept issuing imaginary consequences as she backed away. That continued speech mattered. She wasn't disengaging. She was continuing the behavior. I warned her once more, formally this time. She ignored it. At that point, the collapse became procedural. I signaled to the officers positioned out of her line of sight. They approached without urgency, without spectacle, and without emotion. When she turned and saw them, the last of her certainty evaporated. She demanded explanations. She demanded supervisors. She demanded respect. None of that altered the sequence already in motion. She was informed she was being detained pending investigation into harassment and impersonation. She argued. She protested. She accused everyone around her of lying. None of it mattered. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They simply watched as the authority she had pretended to wield was replaced by the real thing. As she was escorted away, something important happened that no one planned. Parents started talking to each other, quietly at first, then openly. Stories emerged. Patterns aligned. What she had done to one family, she had done to many. What had felt isolated was suddenly shared. That collective recognition was more devastating to her than the arrest itself. Power dies fastest when people realize they were never alone. The bus arrived on time. Kids boarded like they always had. Routine resumed around the wreckage of her authority. That normalcy was the final humiliation. She wasn't removed amid chaos or drama. She was removed amid continuity, like a disruption being corrected. By the time the bus pulled away, HOA Karen was no longer the center of anything. She was a problem being processed. The crowd dispersed slowly, not out of fear this time, but out of closure. The confrontation didn't end with shouting or declarations. It ended with silence returning to a place where it belonged. Her collapse wasn't loud. It was complete. Retaliation didn't come in the form of raised voices or dramatic statements. It came in the form of professionals doing exactly what they were trained to do, because real power doesn't rush. Once HOA Karen was removed from the scene, the system took over in a way she had never anticipated and could never interrupt. She had built her influence on intimidation and improvisation, but systems don't improvise. They document, verify, and dismantle. The first step was administrative, not criminal, and that distinction mattered. Abuse of authority collapses fastest when every layer is addressed simultaneously. Internal review was triggered immediately, not to investigate me, but to formalize the chain of events. Statements were collected from parents, officers, school officials, and witnesses who had never spoken up before because no one had ever asked them to do so safely. Once asked, they didn't hesitate. Silence breaks quickly when people realize they are protected. Legal experts stepped in next, not to debate her claims, but to strip them of oxygen. Municipal attorneys confirmed in writing what had already been established verbally. No HOA jurisdiction, no enforcement authority, no standing to issue directives, and no lawful basis for her conduct. Those confirmations weren't loud, but they were permanent. Paper outlives shouting every time. Child advocacy specialists reviewed the footage and statements. Their focus wasn't punishment, it was impact. Adults threatening children leaves marks that don't show up on police reports unless someone looks for them. Their assessments were clear. Her conduct created fear, confusion, and a sense of vulnerability in minors who had done nothing wrong. That elevated the response from correction to consequence. The school district took action independently, which mattered more than people realized. They issued formal notices clarifying that no individual or group had authority to regulate access to public bus stops. That notice went out to every family in the area. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about removing the ambiguity she had exploited. Ambiguity is a predator's favorite environment. Financial review followed because intimidation often pairs with extraction. Investigators examined whether any fees, donations, or contributions had been solicited under false pretenses. Even when no money changes hands, the attempt matters. Coercion doesn't need a completed transaction to be illegal. It only needs intent and pressure. That review added weight to everything else. HOA Karen attempted to reframe herself as misunderstood. She claimed she was only trying to help. She claimed she had been misrepresented. She claimed she was being targeted unfairly. None of that survived contact with documentation. Experts don't argue with narratives. They compare them to evidence. Her story didn't match the record, and records don't bend. The final layer was preventative, not punitive. Policy adjustments were drafted to prevent anyone else from attempting the same behavior. Clear signage, clear communication, clear jurisdictional boundaries. The goal wasn't to create more rules. It was to eliminate the gray space she had weaponized. Once that space disappeared, so did the opportunity for someone like her to operate again. What made the retaliation effective wasn't aggression. It was coordination. Every expert involved understood their role and stayed within it. No grandstanding, no ego, just precise, layered response. That kind of retaliation doesn't just end a problem, it teaches a lesson to anyone watching quietly from the sidelines. By the time the process concluded, HOA Karen wasn't facing one authority. She was facing all of them at once, aligned and uninterested in her excuses. That alignment is what she had never planned for. She assumed any challenge would be fragmented and temporary. She was wrong. The experts didn't humiliate her. They didn't need to. They removed her ability to act, to claim, to intimidate, and to repeat. That removal was clean, thorough, and irreversible. Her retaliation wasn't emotional. It was structural, and structures don't argue back. Total victory doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly. The way a room feels after a noise you didn't realize was constant finally stops. In the days that followed, the bus stop returned to what it was always meant to be, a place of routine, not tension. Parents arrived without scanning for threats. Kids talked instead of whispering. No one adjusted their behavior to avoid a person who believed she owned the sidewalk. That absence said more than any statement ever could. HOA Karen didn't make a public apology. She didn't issue a clarification. She didn't try to reclaim the narrative. She vanished from the space she once dominated, and that disappearance was permanent. There were no meetings to attend, no warnings to fear, no rules to memorize. The structure she pretended to lead evaporated the moment it was forced into the light. Without confusion to hide behind, it couldn't survive. My kid stopped asking questions about rules that never existed. He went back to worrying about things kids should worry about, like homework and weekend plans. The memory of that morning faded, the way bad memories do when they're corrected quickly and decisively. That mattered more to me than any consequence she faced. Justice that doesn't restore normalcy isn't finished. Neighbors spoke to each other differently afterward. Not louder, not angrier, just more openly. When people realize a threat was never legitimate, they stop treating it like one. That realization spread faster than fear ever had. The community didn't celebrate. It exhaled. That's the sound of control being released. There were no follow-up confrontations, no appeals, no attempts to reassert authority through proxies or complaints. The channels she relied on were closed, documented, and clarified. She had no room left to maneuver. Power built on assumption collapses when assumption is removed. I didn't need to remind anyone who I was. I went back to being another parent at the curb, another professional doing his job, another person moving through his day without incident. That anonymity was the point. Real authority doesn't linger in public spaces once the problem is resolved. It withdraws. HOA Karen became a footnote in a file, and nothing more. No speeches, no lessons, no redemption arc, just a name attached to a resolved issue. That's the coldest outcome for someone who craved control and attention. Silence where she expected influence. The bus kept coming every morning. Kids kept boarding. Parents kept leaving for work. The sidewalk stayed public, and nobody argued after that.